Girl waves to cop at mall, notices an important detail, and knows he has to act fast. It was a typical Saturday afternoon at the Westfield Mall, the kind of day where the air buzzed with the sounds of laughter, chatter, and the occasional ding of a cash register. Shoppers moved in waves, their arms laden with bags, while the scent of freshly baked pretzels and cinnamon rolls wafted through the corridors. For 12-year-old Emily Carter, it was just another weekend outing with her mom. But what started as an ordinary trip to the mall would soon turn into a day she'd never forget. Emily wasn't like most kids her age. She had a knack for noticing things, little details that others often overlooked, like the way the old man at the coffee shop always stirred his drink exactly 3 times, or how the security guard at the toy store tapped his badge twice before starting his shift. Her mom called it a gift, but Emily didn't think much of it. It was just who she was. That is, until she noticed something that would change everything. She was sitting at a table in the food court, licking the last of her mint chocolate chip ice cream, when she saw him, Officer Mark Harris, the friendly cop who always patrolled the mall. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a warm smile that made kids feel safe and parents feel reassured. Emily had seen him dozens of times before, and she always made a point to wave. Today was no different. She raised her hand and gave him a cheerful wave, expecting the usual smile and nod in return. But something was off. Officer Harris waved back, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. There was a tension in his posture, a stiffness that Emily couldn't quite place. And then she saw it. The tiny, almost imperceptible detail that made her heart skip a beat. On his belt, next to his radio, was a small, silver keychain. It was shaped like a star, but what caught Emily's attention was a faint red light blinking at its center. She froze, her ice cream cone slipping from her hand and landing with a soft splat on the floor. She'd seen that keychain before on the news. It was a distress signal used by undercover officers in danger. Her mind raced as the pieces fell into place. Officer Harris wasn't just a mall cop. He was undercover, and he was in trouble. Emily's eyes darted around the food court, searching for anything that might confirm her suspicions. That's when she noticed them. A group of men in hoodies, sitting at a table near the escalator. They weren't eating or talking like the other shoppers. Instead, their eyes were fixed on Officer Harris, tracking his every move. One of them leaned over and whispered something to the others, and they all nodded in unison. Emily's stomach churned. These weren't just ordinary mall-goers. They were dangerous, and they were watching him. Her heart pounded as she tried to figure out what to do. Should she tell someone? But who would believe a 12-year-old girl? And even if they did, would it be too late? She thought about her dad, who always said, "When you see someone in trouble, don't wait for someone else to act. Be the one who makes a difference." Those words echoed in her mind as she made her decision. She had to do something. She had to help. Emily stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. She kept her eyes on Officer Harris as he walked toward the service elevator near the back of the food court. The men in hoodies exchanged glances and followed him, their movements deliberate and calculated. Emily's breath quickened. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have backup. All she had was her quick thinking and the courage to do what was right. As the elevator doors closed behind Officer Harris and the men, Emily knew she was running out of time. She glanced around, her mind racing for a solution. That's when she spotted the mall security office just a few feet away. Without a second thought, she sprinted toward it, her sneakers slapping against the tiled floor. She burst through the door, gasping for breath, and found herself face to face with a startled security guard. "You need to help him," she blurted out, her voice shaking. "Officer Harris. He's in trouble. There are men following him, and he's undercover, and his keychain is blinking." The guard stared at her for a moment, his brow furrowed in confusion. But something in Emily's eyes must have convinced him, because he grabbed his radio and barked into it. Code red. "Officer Harris is compromised. Repeat, Officer Harris is compromised. All units to the service elevator. Now." Emily's heart raced as she followed the guard out of the office, her mind spinning with fear and hope. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She had done everything she could. Now, all she could do was wait and hope it was enough. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she followed the security guard out of the office and into the bustling mall corridor. The guard, whose name tag read J. Martinez, was speaking rapidly into his radio, his voice tight with urgency. Emily struggled to keep up with his long strides, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. "Stay close," Martinez said, glancing back at her. His tone was firm but not unkind. "You did the right thing by coming to us, but this is dangerous. I need you to stay out of the way, okay?" Emily nodded, though her mind was racing. She couldn't just stand by and do nothing, not when Officer Harris's life might be on the line. But she also knew Martinez was right. She was just a kid. What could she possibly do against a group of dangerous criminals? As they approached the service elevator, Martinez signaled for two other guards to join them. They moved with precision, their faces set in grim determination. Emily hung back, her eyes darting around the corridor. The mall was still bustling with shoppers, oblivious to the danger unfolding just a few feet away. "Elevators on the lower level," one of the guards said, checking a handheld device. "They're heading toward the loading dock." Martinez cursed under his breath. "That's where the delivery trucks come in. If they get him out of the mall, we'll lose him." Emily's stomach churned at the thought. She remembered the men in hoodies, their cold, calculating eyes, the way they'd followed Officer Harris like predators stalking their prey. She couldn't let them hurt him. She just couldn't. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are they after him?" Martinez hesitated, then crouched down to her level. "Listen, kid, Officer Harris isn't just a mall cop. He's been working undercover for months, trying to take down a smuggling ring that's been using the mall as a front. These guys are dangerous. If they find out he's a cop," he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Emily's imagination filled in the blanks, and a shiver ran down her spine. She thought about the blinking keychain, the silent cry for help that only she had noticed. If she hadn't been paying attention, if she hadn't acted, "We're going to get him out of there," Martinez said, standing up. "But you need to stay here. It's not safe for you to come any further." Emily nodded again, though every fiber of her being screamed at her to follow. She watched as Martinez and the other guards disappeared down a narrow staircase, their radios crackling with updates. For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Then she remembered something her dad had told her. Asterisk sometimes. The bravest thing you can do is ask for help. Asterisk. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her fingers shaking as she explained the situation to the operator. "There's a cop in trouble at the Westfield Mall," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "He's undercover, and there are men trying to hurt him. Please, you have to send help." The operator assured her that officers were on the way, but Emily knew time was running out. She glanced around the corridor, her mind racing. She couldn't just stand there and wait. She had to do something. That's when she noticed a security camera mounted on the ceiling. It was pointed toward the service elevator, its red light blinking steadily. An idea began to form in her mind, a risky, desperate idea, but it was the only one she had. She ran back to the security office, her breath coming in short gasps. The door was still open, and the room was empty except for a bank of monitors showing live footage from the mall's cameras. Emily's eyes scanned the screens until she found the one she was looking for, the loading dock. The footage was grainy, but she could make out the shapes of several people moving in the shadows. One of them was Officer Harris. He was surrounded by the men in hoodies, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Emily's heart sank as she realized how outnumbered he was. She grabbed the phone on the desk and dialed Martinez's number, praying he would pick up. After what felt like an eternity, he answered. "Martinez," he barked, his voice tense. "It's Emily," she said quickly. I'm in the security office. I can see them on the cameras. They're on the loading dock, and Officer Harris is surrounded. You have to hurry. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Martinez said, "Stay where you are. We're almost there." Emily hung up the phone and turned back to the monitors. The men were moving now, forcing Officer Harris toward a waiting van. Her stomach twisted as she realized what was about to happen. If they got him into that van, he might never be seen again. She couldn't let that happen. Without thinking, she grabbed a walkie-talkie from the desk and ran out of the office. She didn't have a plan, but she knew she had to do something, anything, to buy Martinez and the guards more time. As she sprinted down the corridor toward the loading dock, she pressed a button on the walkie-talkie and shouted, "Hey, over here." The men turned at the sound of her voice, their faces twisted in confusion and anger. For a split second, their attention was diverted from Officer Harris. It was all the opening he needed. In one swift motion, he disarmed the man closest to him and spun around, using the man's body as a shield. The other men scrambled to react, but they were too slow. Martinez and the guards burst onto the scene, their weapons drawn. "Freeze!" Martinez shouted, his voice echoing through the loading dock. The men hesitated, their eyes darting between the guards and the van. For a moment, it seemed like they might surrender, but then one of them lunged at Officer Harris, and all hell broke loose. Emily watched in horror as the scene descended into chaos. She wanted to help, but she knew she was in over her head. All she could do was stay out of the way and hope that Martinez and the guards could handle it. As the sound of sirens filled the air, Emily felt a surge of relief. The police were here. Officer Harris was going to be okay. But as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. One of the men in hoodies was staring right at her, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. And then he smiled. The loading dock was chaos. Shouts echoed off the concrete walls, and the sound of scuffling feet mixed with the wail of approaching sirens. Emily stood frozen near the entrance, her heart pounding as she watched the scene unfold. Officer Harris was fighting back now, his movements sharp and precise as he disarmed one of the men and shoved him to the ground. Martinez and the other guards were closing in, their weapons trained on the remaining assailants. But the man who had smiled at Emily, the one with the cold, calculating eyes, was nowhere to be seen. "Emily, get out of here," Martinez shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. She wanted to obey, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Her eyes darted around the loading dock, searching for the man who had vanished. He was dangerous. She could feel it in her bones. And if he got away, he could come back. He could hurt Officer Harris. He could hurt her. The thought sent a jolt of fear through her, and she finally turned to run. But as she did, she heard a voice behind her, a low, menacing growl that made her blood run cold. "Not so fast, kid." She spun around and came face to face with the man. He was taller up close, his hood pulled low over his face, but she could still see the malice in his eyes. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice, and yanked her toward him. "Let me go!" Emily screamed, struggling against his hold. But the man just laughed, a cold, humorless sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You've caused enough trouble already," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "But don't worry. You'll get what's coming to you." Emily's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. She kicked and thrashed, but the man was too strong. He dragged her toward the van, his grip tightening with every step. "Help!" she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Somebody, please." But the others were too busy dealing with the remaining assailants to notice. Officer Harris was locked in a struggle with one of the men, while Martinez and the guards were trying to subdue the others. No one saw what was happening to Emily. Just as the man reached the van, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Let her go!" Emily turned her head and saw Officer Harris, standing a few feet away, his gun trained on the man. His face was bruised and bloodied, but his eyes were steady, filled with a fierce determination. The man hesitated, his grip on Emily loosening slightly. "You really think you can stop me?" he sneered. "You're outnumbered, cop. And once my guys are done with your friends, you're next." Officer Harris didn't flinch. "Maybe," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But if you hurt that girl, you'll have to go through me first." For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with tension, the sound of the sirens growing louder by the second. Then, with a snarl, the man shoved Emily to the ground and lunged at Officer Harris. Emily scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she watched the two men grapple. Officer Harris was strong, but the man was relentless, his movements fueled by rage. They crashed into the side of the van, the impact sending a shudder through the vehicle. "Emily, run!" Officer Harris shouted, his voice strained as he struggled to hold the man back. But Emily couldn't leave him, not after everything he'd done to protect her. She looked around frantically, searching for something, anything, she could use to help. Her eyes landed on a metal pipe, lying on the ground a few feet away. Without thinking, she grabbed the pipe and ran toward the men. The man had Officer Harris pinned against the van now, his hands around his throat. Emily swung the pipe with all her might, the metal connecting with the man's side with a sickening thud. He let out a roar of pain and stumbled back, releasing his grip on Officer Harris. Emily didn't hesitate. She swung the pipe again, this time aiming for his legs. The man went down hard, his head hitting the pavement with a dull thunk. For a moment, everything was still. Then Officer Harris grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her away from the man, his breathing ragged. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Emily nodded, though her hands were shaking. "I'm fine," she said. "But what about you?" Before Officer Harris could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed through the loading dock. Emily turned and saw Martinez and the guards running toward them, their faces grim. "We've got the others," Martinez said, his voice tight. "But we need to get out of here. Now." Officer Harris nodded, his eyes scanning the area. "Where's the leader?" he asked. Martinez frowned. "What leader?" Emily's stomach dropped as she realized what had happened. The man she'd knocked out, the one who had grabbed her, wasn't the leader. He was just a pawn. The real threat was still out there, and he was watching. Officer Jake Reynolds kept his composure, but inside, his instincts screamed at him. The little girl's hesitant wave had been odd enough, but her eyes, those wide, pleading eyes, told him something was terribly wrong. He scanned the area again. The man holding her hand, the one who had yanked her along too forcefully, didn't look like a father in a rush. He looked like someone in control, someone determined to get away. Jake started moving, his training kicking in. He weaved through the bustling crowd, careful not to alert the man. If this was a custody issue or worse, an abduction, he couldn't afford to spook him. The last thing he wanted was for the suspect to run, taking the girl with him. As he followed, a new problem arose. A sudden commotion near the food court, an argument between two men, escalated into a shoving match. Security guards rushed in, radios buzzing. People turned to watch. Jake gritted his teeth. The distraction couldn't have come at a worse time. The suspect was nearing an exit. Before he could act, his radio crackled. "Officer Reynolds, we need backup at the food court. Possible assault in progress." For a split second, Jake hesitated. His duty demanded he respond, but his gut told him this girl was in danger. He made a split-second decision. "Dispatch, I got a possible child abduction in progress near the east exit. Male suspect, early 40s, plaid jacket, dark jeans. Young girl, 6 or 7, pink jacket, blonde hair. Request immediate support." He picked up the pace. The suspect was getting too close to the doors. Jake was about to call out when a woman suddenly stepped into his path. "Officer, please. My son is missing." The woman's face was pale with panic, her hands trembling. Jake clenched his jaw. "Ma'am, I need you to report this to mall security. I'm in pursuit of—" "He's only 4, she cried. "He was right here a second ago." His heart pounded. The situation was spiraling. 2 missing children, possibly unrelated or possibly connected. Was this part of something bigger? He spotted another officer entering the mall and quickly signaled him. "Officer Daniels, missing child case here. Help this woman. I'm pursuing a possible abduction near the east exit." Daniels nodded, immediately taking over. Jake broke into a jog. The man and the little girl had just stepped outside. Jake pushed through the doors and scanned the area. His stomach dropped. The man was gone. The girl was gone. The parking lot was massive, cars packed in every direction. A van's engine roared to life somewhere nearby. Jake's pulse hammered. Then he heard it, a muffled scream. His blood ran cold. Jake took off at a full sprint. Jake sprinted across the parking lot, his eyes scanning frantically. The muffled scream had been brief, but it was enough to confirm his worst fear. The girl was in immediate danger. His gut told him the van he'd heard moments ago was the key. Dispatch, suspect vehicle, maybe a van. "I need all available units to the east parking lot now," he barked into his radio. His gaze locked onto a dark gray van with its brake lights flaring as it maneuvered toward the exit. Jake didn't hesitate. He charged forward, weaving between parked cars. The van gained speed, tires screeching as it turned sharply toward the main road. "Not on my watch." Jake yanked his radio free. Suspect vehicle heading east on Oak Street. Gray van. Partial plate starts with 4XJ. Cutting off escape now. A blue sedan rolled forward, blocking his direct path. Jake had no choice. He leaped onto the hood, rolling off and landing hard on the pavement before bolting forward. The van hit a speed bump too fast, its back tires bouncing. For a split second, Jake caught a glimpse through the rear window, small hands pressed against the glass. The girl. His adrenaline surged. The van was seconds from hitting the main road, but a stroke of luck arrived. Sirens wailed in the distance. Backup was closing in. Jake sprinted toward his patrol car parked nearby. Just as he reached for the door handle, the radio crackled. "Reynolds, units inbound from the south. Do not engage alone. Repeat, do not engage alone." He knew the protocol, but if that van made it onto the highway, the girl might disappear forever. No time. Jake jumped into his vehicle and fired up the sirens. The van swerved sharply onto Oak Street, forcing other cars to brake suddenly. Jake punched the gas, tearing after it. Up ahead, an intersection loomed. A red light. Pedestrians were crossing. The van wasn't slowing down. "Damn it," Jake muttered. He had one shot. He yanked the wheel, accelerating just enough to get beside the van. With precise timing, he swerved toward the vehicle, clipping its rear panel. The van fishtailed, skidding violently before slamming into a light pole. Jake braked hard and jumped out. "Hands where I can see them," he roared, gun drawn. The driver, a disheveled man in his 40s, shook off the impact, dazed but still conscious. He reached for the gear shift. "Don't even think about it," Jake warned. Backup arrived in a blur of flashing lights. Officers swarmed in, weapons raised. The suspect surrendered, hands up. Jake yanked open the back doors of the van. The little girl sat curled in the corner, eyes wide with terror. "It's okay," Jake said, his voice softer now. "You're safe." Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time, she smiled. Jake's breath came in sharp bursts as he knelt beside the little girl. The van's interior smelled of stale sweat and gasoline, the kind of stench that made his stomach turn. The girl trembled, clutching her pink jacket like a lifeline, her small frame shaking with silent sobs. "You're okay," Jake reassured her gently, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I've got you." Her wide blue eyes locked onto his, the fear in them still raw. But then, recognition. He was the cop she had waved to, the cop who had noticed. A sob broke free from her throat. She lunged forward, throwing her arms around his neck. Jake let out a slow breath, holding her just tight enough to let her know she was safe. Behind him, officers swarmed the scene. One cuffed the suspect, Harold Myers, a man with a long record of petty crimes, but nothing like this. Another officer searched the van, coming back with a sickened expression. "We found rope, duct tape, and a burner phone," Officer Daniel said grimly. He wasn't just planning on taking her, Jake. He was preparing to disappear. Jake's grip on the girl tightened for a moment before he forced himself to exhale. They had stopped him in time. Then his radio crackled. "All units, be advised, second missing child alert at the mall. 4-year-old boy, brown hair, blue hoodie. Last seen near the food court." Jake's stomach dropped. The woman who had stopped him earlier. Her missing son. He pulled back to look at the little girl. "Sweetheart, do you know if this man had another child with him?" She shook her head quickly, her tiny fingers gripping his sleeve. "No," she whispered, "but he was talking to someone on the phone. He said to keep the boy quiet." Jake shot to his feet. "Daniels, get her to medics. I need to get back to the mall. Now." Daniels nodded, lifting the girl into his arms as she clung to him. "We'll take care of her. Go." Jake didn't waste another second. He sprinted to his cruiser, throwing it into drive with a screech of tires. A second suspect, a second child, and time was running out. The mall was a flurry of chaos when Jake arrived. Mall security had locked down the exits, but the sheer size of the place made it a nightmare to search. The boy could be anywhere. The mother stood near the food court, her face streaked with tears, clutching the security guard's arm like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Jake ran to her. "Ma'am, I need you to think. Did you see anyone suspicious before your son disappeared?" She swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. Yes, I remember now. A man. He was standing near the play area, watching the kids. I thought he was just waiting for someone. But when I turned around, my son was gone, and so was he." Jake's mind raced. If this was coordinated, then the second suspect had planned his escape before the abduction even happened. A radio call came through. "We've got surveillance footage," a security officer said. The suspect took the boy into a staff-only hallway near the east wing. Jake was already moving. He tore through the mall, his pulse pounding. Staff hallways, narrow, dimly lit, a maze of storage rooms and emergency exits. A perfect place to disappear. When he reached the hallway entrance, his hand went instinctively to his holster. He moved cautiously, every sense on high alert. Then a sound, a child's muffled whimper. Jake's jaw clenched. He followed the sound, turning a corner just in time to see a man pushing open an emergency exit, a small figure struggling in his grasp. "Police! Stop right there!" Jake bellowed, his gun drawn. The man froze. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the mall behind him. Then, without warning, the suspect bolted, with the child still in his arms. Jake didn't hesitate. He ran. Jake's heart pounded as he tore down the dimly lit hallway, his boots slamming against the tiled floor. The suspect clutched the boy tightly, his arms wrapped around the child like a human shield. The emergency exit door swung shut behind them, the alarm blaring through the corridor. Jake burst through the door, just in time to see the man sprinting toward the parking lot. "Stop!" Jake roared, his gun trained on the suspect. "Put the child down now." The man glanced back, panic flashing in his eyes. He gripped the boy tighter, yanking him toward a parked sedan with an open door. If he got inside, he'd be gone. Not happening. Jake holstered his gun. He couldn't risk a shot with the boy in the way. Instead, he charged forward, closing the distance fast. The suspect fumbled with the car door, trying to shove the child inside. But the boy, small and terrified, kicked wildly, his screams cutting through the air. Jake took his shot, not with his gun, with his body. He lunged, slamming into the man's side with full force. The impact sent them both crashing to the pavement. The boy tumbled backward onto the ground, rolling away as the suspect groaned, momentarily dazed. Jake moved fast. He flipped the man onto his stomach, wrenching his arms behind his back. "Don't move," Jake growled, snapping the cuffs around the suspect's wrists. The man struggled, but Jake had the advantage. Within seconds, backup arrived, officers swarming the scene. Jake exhaled sharply, then turned to the boy. The child sat on the pavement, hugging his knees, his breath coming in quick gasps. Jake crouched beside him, softening his tone. "You're safe now, buddy," he said gently. "It's over." The boy hesitated, then flung himself into Jake's arms. Jake held him steady, feeling the tremors in the small frame. Sirens wailed in the distance. The boy's mother came running, her sobs echoing across the parking lot. The second she saw her son, she collapsed to her knees, arms outstretched. "Mommy!" The boy cried, breaking away from Jake and sprinting into her embrace. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched him tightly. "Oh, baby! Thank God! Thank God!" Jake stood, his body aching, but relief flooding through him. The nightmare was over. Both kids were safe. As officers hauled the suspect away, one of them clapped Jake on the shoulder. "Hell of a catch, Reynolds." Jake let out a breath, watching as the mother rocked her son back and forth, whispering reassurances. This was why he did the job. Because sometimes, noticing the smallest detail, like a little girl's hesitant wave, could save a life. The flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars painted streaks across the darkening sky. The mall parking lot was still a scene of chaos. Officers securing the area, reporters setting up cameras, and frantic parents clutching their children just a little tighter. But at its core, the nightmare had ended. Jake stood near his cruiser, rubbing the stiffness out of his shoulder from the tackle. His pulse had finally begun to slow, but his mind was still replaying the last frantic moments. The chase, the boy's screams, the suspect's desperate attempt to escape. It could have ended so much worse. A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Officer?" Jake turned to see the little girl, the one who had waved at him in the mall. She stood beside Officer Daniels, wrapped in a warm police-issued blanket, her small fingers gripping the edges. She still looked shaken, but there was something new in her expression. Trust. Jake crouched down to her level. "Hey there, kiddo. How are you holding up?" She hesitated, then took a tiny step closer. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. Something caught in Jake's throat. He'd been in law enforcement for years, but this moment, the quiet relief in a rescued child's eyes, was what made it all worth it. He nodded. "I'm glad you waved at me. You helped me see something wasn't right." The girl's lips quirked into the smallest smile, then she glanced past him. "What about the boy?" Jake followed her gaze. A few feet away, the 4-year-old boy clung to his mother, his tiny hands gripping her coat like she might disappear if he let go. The mother, still crying softly, kept whispering into his ear, rocking him gently. "He's okay," Jake assured her. "Because of you?" The girl tilted her head. "Me?" Jake smiled. "Yeah, you trusted me enough to ask for help. That's really brave." She seemed to think about that for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded-up paper. She hesitated before offering it to him. "It's my drawing," she said shyly. "I was making it before everything." Jake took it carefully and unfolded it. The crayon drawing showed a police officer standing tall beside a little girl. Above them was a big, bright sun, and scrawled in wobbly handwriting was one word: Hero. For the first time that day, Jake felt his chest lighten. He looked at the girl, his voice warm. "This is the best thing I've seen all day." She beamed, her earlier fear finally starting to fade. Just then, Daniels walked up. "Her parents are here. They've been looking for her for hours. They're beyond relieved." He knelt beside the girl. ready to go home. She nodded but then turned back to Jake. "Will I see you again?" Jake chuckled softly. "Well, I'm always around, but I hope you don't have to wave at me because you're in trouble again." She giggled, then surprised him by wrapping her arms around his neck in a quick hug. "Thank you." Jake patted her back gently. "You take care, kiddo." As Daniels led her toward her parents, Jake watched as her mother and father scooped her up, hugging her tightly as though they'd never let go. The sight made something settle deep in his chest. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Reynolds, you're a damn good cop." Jake turned to see his sergeant, a gruff man with years of experience written in the lines of his face. He was watching Jake with an approving nod. "You followed your instincts," the sergeant continued. "If you hadn't noticed that little girl's wave, we might not have gotten to those kids in time." Jake exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just doing my job." The sergeant smirked. "Yeah, well, you did it damn well today." Jake looked out over the scene. The grateful families, the suspects being hauled away, the officers securing the last details. The weight of the day settled over him. But for once, it felt like a weight worth carrying, because tonight, 2 kids would sleep safely in their own beds. And it all started with a little wave. The mall parking lot had mostly cleared out by the time Jake leaned against his cruiser, letting the cool night air settle around him. The flashing lights had faded, replaced by the hum of normalcy returning. Families reunited. Tears gave way to relieved smiles, and order was slowly restored. But Jake knew things could have ended differently. He glanced down at the crayon drawing still in his hand. The word hero stood out bright and bold. He let out a slow breath. He didn't think of himself as a hero, just a guy doing his job, trying to be in the right place at the right time. And today, thank God, he had been. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You look like a man in desperate need of coffee." Jake turned to see Officer Daniels holding out a steaming cup. He smirked, taking it. "You read my mind." Daniels sipped his own coffee, leaning on the cruiser beside him. "You know, most people wouldn't have thought twice about that little girl waving. But you noticed." He shook his head. "That's rare." Jake exhaled, staring out at the street beyond the mall. It wasn't just a wave. It was a sign. Something was off. He turned the cup in his hands. "I've learned over the years that the smallest things can mean everything." Daniels nodded. "Well, you saved 2 kids today. That's got to feel good." Jake took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth chase away the lingering tension in his chest. "Yeah," he admitted. "It does?" The 2 men stood in silence for a moment, watching as the last of the patrol cars pulled away. Then Jake sighed. "Come on, let's get back to the station. Paperwork isn't going to fill itself out." Daniels groaned. "You really know how to kill the moment, Reynolds." Jake chuckled as he climbed into his cruiser. As he pulled out onto the road, he glanced at the drawing one last time before tucking it safely into the visor above him. Not all days on the job ended well, but today was one of the good ones. And sometimes that was enough.